That's all I had left. 8 days until I walked down an aisle in a dress I'd tried on 11 times, just to feel the fabric settle right over my shoulders. 8 days until the man I loved would be standing there, waiting for me, promising me forever in front of everyone we knew. And that's the day my mother looked me in the eye and said 4 words that broke something in me I don't think has ever fully healed. Figure it out yourself. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because I did. I sat with it for a long time, in a parking lot, in my car, with the engine off and my hands shaking so hard I couldn't turn the key. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what happened to me, because maybe, just maybe, it happened to you too. Maybe someone you trusted looked you in the eye and made you a promise. And then, when it mattered most, they vanished. If that's you, I want you to know something before we even begin. You are not the only one who has ever had to figure it out alone. And sometimes, alone is exactly where you find out who you really are. Let me take you back to where this all started. Not 8 days before the wedding. Further back than that. Because I've learned that betrayal never actually begins on the day you find out about it. It begins long before, quietly, in rooms you weren't invited into, in conversations you never heard, in decisions made about your life without your knowledge. By the time you learn the truth, the damage has usually already been sitting there for months, sometimes years, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally surface. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knows whose car is parked outside whose house, and where the diner on Main Street has served the same coffee in the same chipped mugs since before I was born. My father built furniture with his hands, sturdy, plain, honest things like he was. He had a workshop behind our house that smelled like sawdust and machine oil. And as a little girl I used to sit on an overturned bucket in the corner and watch him work for hours, mesmerized by the way he could take a rough plank of wood and turn it into something someone would keep for the rest of their life. My mother kept the books for his little shop and never once, not once in 26 years, missed paying a bill late. She was the kind of woman who wrote thank you notes by hand, who remembered every birthday, who ironed pillowcases because she said Uniron pillowcases were the mark of a lazy household. Even though we both knew she didn't really believe that. She just liked things to look cared for. We weren't rich. We were careful. Careful people, careful money, careful promises. I grew up believing that if my parents said something, it was as good as done. If my father said he'd pick me up from soccer practice at 6, he was there at 6, not 6:05. If my mother said she'd bake cookies for the school fundraiser, there would be 4 dozen of them, perfectly arranged, by 7 in the morning. Their word was their currency, and it was worth more to them than actual money ever was. Or so I believed for 26 years. So when I got engaged to Daniel, a quiet, steady man who made me laugh so hard I'd cry, who remembered how I liked my coffee before I even finished saying hi in the mornings, who once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had the flu, my parents were thrilled. My mother cried actual tears in the kitchen, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. My father shook Daniel's hand for what felt like a full minute, like he was testing the weight of it, like he needed to be absolutely sure this man was solid enough to hold his daughter's future. He's a good one, my father said to me later that night, when Daniel had gone home and it was just the 2 of us doing dishes at the sink, the way we always had. You did well. I remember feeling like my chest might burst from happiness. I had my parents' approval. I had the man I loved. And I had a life stretching out ahead of me that felt, for the first time, entirely settled. Entirely safe. And when it came time to talk about the wedding, they were the ones who brought it up first. We were sitting at that same kitchen table. The one with the small burn mark near the edge from a candle my mother had set down without a coaster back in 2003. A mark she refused to sand out because she said it told a story. When my mother slid a folded piece of paper across the table toward me. "We want to help," she said. I opened it. On it, in my father's careful, blocky handwriting, the kind of handwriting that always looked like it belonged on a blueprint rather than a note. $40,000. I remember staring at that number like it was a mirage, like if I blinked it might rearrange itself into something smaller, something I could actually process. $42,000. I had never seen that many zeros attached to anything that belonged to me. "This is too much," I said. "This is, Mom, Dad, this is way too much. We can do something small." We can do something simple. City Hall, even. I don't need. You're our only daughter, my father said. And his voice had a firmness in it that I recognized from every important conversation of my childhood. The tone he used when a decision had already been made and there was no point arguing. Let us do this. Let us give you this one thing. We've been saving for this since you were small. Let us give you the wedding your mother never got to have. That last part hit something soft in me. I knew the story. My mother's own wedding decades ago had been a rushed courthouse affair because her family couldn't afford anything more. She told me once, half laughing, half wistful, that she wore a dress borrowed from her cousin and carried flowers she'd picked herself from the side of the road on the way to the courthouse. She'd always said it didn't matter, that the marriage was what counted, not the ceremony. But I'd also seen the way her eyes lingered on wedding photos in magazines, the way she'd cut out pictures of flower arrangements from catalogs and tucked them into a drawer she thought I didn't know about. So I let them give me this. I let myself believe that this was my mother, finally, getting to have the wedding she'd always wanted, through me. I want to tell you that I didn't build my whole wedding around that number, but I'd be lying. The venue, a restored barn about 40 minutes outside of town, with exposed wooden beams and a view of rolling hills that turned gold in the late afternoon light. The florist, a woman named Renata, who did the most extraordinary things with wildflowers and eucalyptus. Arrangements that looked like they'd grown there naturally rather than been assembled. The dress, oh the dress. I tried on 11 of them before I found the one. A soft ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves that made me cry the moment I saw myself in the mirror, not because it was the most expensive one I tried, but because for the first time I looked at my reflection and thought, there she is. There's the woman about to marry Daniel. The caterer required a deposit I could never have paid on a teacher's salary. I taught 3rd grade, and I loved it, but nobody goes into elementary education for the money. The photographer, a woman whose portfolio made me want to weep with how beautifully she captured ordinary, unguarded moments. The band, the lighting, the little details that don't seem like much individually but add up, quietly, into a number that would have been impossible without my parents' gift. Every choice I made in the months that followed was built on the foundation of that promise. $40,000, given freely, by people I trusted with my whole heart. I had no reason not to trust them. Not yet. But here's the thing about foundations. You don't know how solid they are until something heavy is standing on top of them. And I was about to find out that mine had been cracked long before I ever knew to look. 3 months before the wedding, I noticed my mother getting quiet whenever money came up. Little things, at first. The way she changed the subject when I mentioned the final catering payment. The way she suddenly developed an interest in the weather forecast whenever I asked how the shop was doing. I noticed my father staying later at the workshop, coming home with a kind of tiredness that sat behind his eyes instead of in his shoulders. A tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. I told myself it was stress. Wedding stress. Parent of the bride stress. Everyone said weddings were expensive and exhausting for the whole family, not just the couple getting married. I told myself a lot of things, because it was easier than asking the question that was already forming, somewhere deep down, where I didn't want to look. There was one evening, about 2 months before the wedding, when I stopped by the shop unannounced to bring my father lunch. Something I used to do as a surprise, back when I was in college and had a car and free afternoons. I walked in and found him standing very still at his workbench, not working, just standing there with a piece of paper in his hand, staring at it the way you stare at something you wish you could unsee. He folded it quickly when he heard the door chime, tucked it into his apron pocket, and smiled at me in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What's that?" I asked, holding up the paper bag of sandwiches like a peace offering. "Just an order form," he said. "Slow week. You know how it is." I didn't push. I wish, more than almost anything else in this story, that I had pushed. But I was 26 years old and swept up in centerpiece samples and seating charts. And I let it go. The way you let go of 100 small warning signs because you don't want to believe what they might be trying to tell you. Something was wrong. And I was about to find out just how wrong. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days Daniel and I met his mother for lunch at this little Italian place downtown that did a lunch special on soup and half a sandwich. And I'd left that lunch early because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing against the wooden table, loud enough that Daniel's mother had raised an eyebrow at it. 6 missed calls from my mother. Then a 7th, coming in even as I stared at the screen. That never happened. My mother texted. My mother sent long, rambling voice notes about nothing in particular. Updates on the neighbor's new fence, complaints about the price of eggs, reminders about things I already knew. My mother did not call 6 times in 20 minutes. When I finally reached her, standing outside on the sidewalk with my coat only half buttoned against the wind, her voice didn't sound like her voice. "Can you come by the house?" she said. Not a question. A request dressed up as something softer, but underneath it, I could hear it. The shake, the thing she was trying so hard to keep out of her tone. "Mom, what's wrong? Is Dad okay? Is someone hurt?" "Everyone's fine," she said too quickly. "Just please, come by the house." I drove straight there, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest the whole way, like it already knew before I did. I remember the drive in fragments, the way the light hit the windshield, the song on the radio I couldn't tell you the name of if you paid me, the way my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. My father was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. Not standing, the way he usually greeted me, arms already opening for a hug. Sitting, hunched over, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold. I could tell because there was no steam, and my father never let his coffee go cold. He always drank it while it was hot, standing at the counter, the way he'd done every morning of my childhood. "What's going on?" I asked, still standing in the doorway. My coat still on, my keys still in my hand. My mother sat down across from me at the table I'd eaten 1,000 meals at. She reached for my hand, and I let her take it, even though something in me already wanted to pull away, some animal instinct screaming that whatever was coming, I wasn't going to like it. "The shop," my father said, and then he stopped. Started again. His voice cracked on the second attempt. "The shop has been struggling. For a while now." I felt my stomach drop, slow and heavy, like a stone sinking through water, down and down with no bottom in sight. "How long is a while?" 14 months, my mother said quietly, and I watched her flinch at her own words, as if saying the number out loud made it more real than she could bear. 14 months. 14 months of careful, honest people quietly falling apart behind a smile they kept polished just for me. 14 months of my father folding papers into his apron pocket. 14 months of my mother changing the subject at exactly the right moments. 14 months of 2 people I trusted more than anyone in the world building an elaborate quiet lie. Brick by brick, session by session, because they couldn't bring themselves to tell me the truth. "The wedding fund," my father said, and I watched him force himself to look at me, because I think some small, decent part of him knew I deserved to see his face when he said it. His eyes were red-rimmed, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than 14 months. "We used it. To keep the shop open. To cover the mortgage. We used all of it." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember the chair scraping against the floor, though my mother told me later that it did, loud enough that the neighbor's dog started barking through the wall. What I remember is the sound of my own voice, small and strange, asking the only question that mattered. "All of it." My mother nodded, her chin trembling. My father couldn't even manage that. He just stared down at his cold coffee, like it might offer him an answer he could give me instead. "There's still time," my mother said, her voice climbing towards something desperate, something that scared me because I had never heard that particular pitch of fear in her before. 8 days. We'll figure something out. We just need you to be patient, and 8 days, I repeated. The words tasted strange in my mouth, like something borrowed from someone else's nightmare. "The wedding is in 8 days. "I know, sweetheart, I know, but you knew this 14 months ago." My voice wasn't shaking anymore. It had gone somewhere cold and flat, somewhere I didn't recognize, a place I don't think I'd ever been before in my life. "You knew, and you let me build an entire wedding on money that didn't exist. You let me pick out flowers. You let me try on dresses. You sat across from Renata the florist, and told her how beautiful the wildflower arch was going to look. You smiled, Mom. You smiled through all of it." "We didn't want to ruin it for you," my mother whispered. We kept thinking we'd find a way to fix it before it mattered. We kept thinking the shop would turn around. And when it didn't? Silence. That was the answer. When it didn't turn around, they kept quiet anyway. They let the calendar count down. They let me send out invitations with a date on them that was slowly turning into a lie. My father finally spoke, and I think he meant it as comfort, though it landed like something else entirely, something that would echo in my chest for years afterward. You're smart. You're resourceful. You'll figure it out. There it was. The sentence that would live in me for years. Not an apology. Not a plan. Not even real regret. Not in that moment. Just a quiet, exhausted hope that I would somehow absorb the consequences of choices I never made. Choices that had been made in rooms I wasn't invited into, over the course of more than a year, while I sat at home addressing envelopes in careful cursive. I want to tell you, I yelled. I want to tell you I said something powerful and cutting that made them understand exactly what they'd done. Some line that would replay in their heads for the rest of their lives. But the truth is, I just stood there in that kitchen I'd grown up in, surrounded by the careful, honest people who raised me, surrounded by the burn mark on the table that told a story. And I felt something enormous and quiet break open inside my chest. Not loud, not explosive, just a deep, structural crack, like a foundation finally giving way after years of quiet pressure. I need to go, I said. Please, sweetheart, let's talk about this. I can't. Not right now. I need to go. I drove home in silence. I don't remember turning the radio off, but it was off. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached the next day. I remember pulling into our driveway and sitting there for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, rehearsing and re-rehearsing how I was going to say the words out loud, as if saying them differently might change what they meant. Daniel took one look at my face when I walked through the door, and didn't ask a single question at first. He just crossed the room and held me while I stood there, coat still on, purse still over my shoulder, and I told him everything, my voice breaking apart somewhere in the middle of the word 14. He didn't yell either. I think that's one of the things I love most about him, even now. He doesn't reach for anger the way some people do, as a first response to pain. He got very still instead, the way he does when he's thinking hard about something, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder as his mind worked through the problem like it was a puzzle he refused to lose to. Then we won't figure it out the way they expect, he finally said. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. I was too raw, too freshly wounded, to see past the immediate crisis in front of us. 8 days, no money. A wedding half built on a promise that had just been pulled out from underneath it like a rug. But over the next several days, I would learn that betrayal doesn't just take something from you. It teaches you something too, if you're willing to listen. It taught me that the people who are supposed to protect you can be the very ones who leave you standing in the wreckage. And it taught me that the only person who will always show up for you completely is the one you become in the aftermath. I spent that first night awake, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in my head that never balanced. I thought about calling every vendor and canceling everything, just walking away from the whole thing and eloping somewhere quiet, somewhere none of this would matter. I thought about the deposit on the venue we'd never see again. Non-refundable, of course. We'd signed that contract 8 months earlier without a second thought. I thought about my mother's face, and how some small, foolish part of me still wanted to protect her from what this had done to me. Still wanted to call her back and tell her it was okay. Even though it wasn't. Even though some part of me suspected it might never fully be okay again. I thought about all the things I hadn't asked. Why hadn't I noticed sooner? Why hadn't I asked more questions when my father tucked that paper into his apron? Why had I been so willing to believe that everything was fine, simply because believing it was easier? But somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying next to Daniel's steady breathing, something shifted in me. The grief didn't disappear. Grief like that doesn't disappear. It just changes shape over time, folding itself into something you learn to carry rather than something that carries you. But underneath it, something harder and clearer started to form. I realized I had spent my whole life being the careful daughter of careful people, believing that carefulness was the same thing as reliability. And look where that had gotten me. Standing in the wreckage of a promise I never should have trusted so completely, simply because it came from the two people I'd trusted with everything else. If I was going to figure it out myself, then I was going to figure it out on my own terms. Not out of spite. Not out of anger, even though the anger was there, sitting hot and heavy in my chest. But because somewhere in that long, sleepless night, I stopped waiting for someone else to fix what had been broken. And I started asking myself a different question entirely. What do I actually want this wedding, this marriage, to be built on? Not money. Not a promise that could be quietly withdrawn. Something sturdier than that. Something more like the furniture my father used to build, before everything fell apart. Something made to last, put together by hands that cared enough to do the work properly. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. It wasn't fully formed yet, but it was mine. I want to be honest with you about something, before I tell you the rest. This isn't a story about a dramatic, cinematic revenge. No confrontation at the altar, no scandal shouted across a crowded room. No villain publicly humiliated in front of 200 guests while a string quartet plays ominously in the background. What I did instead was quieter than that, and I think in the end it was more powerful because it wasn't built on making my parents suffer. It was built on refusing to let their failure define what came next. The first call I made, at 7 in the morning with coffee still burning the roof of my mouth, was to my best friend Priya. Priya worked in event planning for a firm 2 towns over, and she owed me exactly one enormous favor from a birthday party disaster 2 years earlier, that I won't get into here except to say it involved a bounce house, a burst water pipe, and 40 screaming 8-year-olds. She picked up on the second ring. "I need help," I said, and then I told her everything, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Oh, give me 2 hours. Don't cancel anything yet." The second call was to Daniel's sister, Marisol, who had a gift, a genuine, almost supernatural gift, for making phone calls sound like miracles. She could call a stranger and somehow leave the conversation with a discount, a favor, a promise of goodwill that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I'd watched her do it before, negotiating a rental car upgrade for free just by asking with the right amount of warmth and specificity. I asked her if she'd be willing to make a few calls on my behalf. She didn't even ask why before she said yes. The third call was the hardest one. I called the venue coordinator myself. A woman named Beth who had been kind to me throughout the entire planning process, who remembered small details about our conversations, who had once spent 20 minutes on the phone with me talking through seating chart anxiety, even though it clearly wasn't part of her job description. I told her the truth. Not all of it, not the full weight of what my parents had done, but enough. I told her that our financial situation had changed unexpectedly, and I needed to understand what our options were. I braced myself for a hard no. Contracts are contracts, and I'd signed one, and I understood that. But Beth was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. "We actually had a cancellation for a smaller event space on your date. It's the loft above the main barn. It holds about 60 people instead of the full 200. It's not what you planned for, but it's beautiful in its own way, and it would cost significantly less. Would you want to see it?" I cried on the phone with a woman I'd only met twice in person. She told me to take my time, that there was no rush, that she'd been doing this job for 11 years and she'd seen worse things happen to good people. Over the next 5 days, something remarkable happened, piece by piece, phone call by phone call. The florist, Renata, when she heard what happened, because small towns talk, and word travels fast, even the parts you wish it wouldn't, cut her price nearly in half without me even asking. She told me, in her thick accent, standing in her shop surrounded by buckets of ranunculus and eucalyptus, that she remembered what it felt like to be young and betrayed by someone who should have protected her. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. She just squeezed my hand and told me she'd make sure my flowers were the best thing about the entire day, cost be damned. The caterer agreed to scale down the menu, fewer options, family style instead of plated, but still elegant, still exactly the kind of food Daniel and I had fallen in love with when we did our tasting 6 months earlier. It cost less than half of what we'd originally budgeted. Daniel's parents, without me ever asking, quietly covered what remained after everything else had been renegotiated and rebuilt. His mother pulled me aside during one of our frantic planning sessions, took both of my hands in hers, and said gently, "This is what family looks like, sweetheart. Let us do this. Not because you owe us anything. Because we love you, and we love watching our son love you, and that's reason enough." I want you to notice something in that sentence, because it's the thing that took me the longest to understand. She used almost the exact same words my own parents had used months earlier. Let us do this. But this time, they meant something entirely different. They weren't a promise made carelessly, to be withdrawn later without warning. They were a promise backed by something solid, something that had already proven itself in 100 smaller ways over the years I'd known this family. I learned, in those 5 frantic days, the difference between a promise and a foundation. A promise is words. A foundation is what's still standing after everything else has been tested. My own parents, meanwhile, sat mostly on the sidelines of this whole frantic rebuilding effort, uncertain of their place in it, uncertain whether I wanted their help at all. My mother called twice a day, offering to do whatever she could, address more envelopes, help move chairs, anything, and each time, I let her help with small, harmless tasks, because I wasn't trying to punish her. I was just no longer trusting her with anything that mattered. There's a particular kind of pain in that. Watching someone you love shrink down to handling napkins and place cards, because you can no longer trust them with anything larger. I saw it on my mother's face every time I handed her a small task instead of a real one. I saw her understand slowly what she had lost. Not just money, not just a wedding fund, but the full weight of my trust, the kind that doesn't come back all at once, if it comes back at all. 8 days after that conversation in my parents' kitchen, I stood in the loft above the barn. 60 guests instead of 200. Wildflowers instead of the elaborate floral arch we'd originally planned. A dress that had been let out slightly at the last minute, because I'd lost weight from stress I didn't know I was carrying. And I married Daniel. It was smaller. It was humbler. It did not look like the wedding I had spent 8 months building in my imagination. And it was, without question, more honest than anything I could have built with my parents' money. I stood there in that loft, sunlight coming in gold through the windows exactly the way I'd imagined it would in the larger barn below. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all, given everything that had happened in the 8 days before. Relief. Not because everything was fixed. My parents' shop was still failing. The debt was still there, quietly growing in the background of all our lives. My trust in them was still cracked, in a way I wasn't sure would ever fully mend. But I felt relief because I had learned, in the hardest way possible, that I did not need the money to have the marriage. I needed the truth. And now, finally, I had it. Even if the truth had cost me almost everything I thought I could rely on. My parents came to the wedding. I let them because whatever else had happened, they were still my parents, and some part of me. The part that remembered my father teaching me to sand wood with the grain instead of against it, the part that remembered my mother's handwritten thank you notes, still wanted them there. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, and I don't know to this day whether those were tears of joy or guilt or some tangled combination of both. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe grief and joy aren't as separate as we like to pretend they are. My father hugged me afterward longer than he ever had before, his arms tight around me in a way that felt like he was trying to say something words hadn't managed to capture. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, his voice rough in a way I'd never heard before. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. But I said, I know, because that was true too. I knew he was sorry. I knew, somewhere underneath the 14 months of silence, there had been genuine agony in watching me build a wedding on a lie he didn't know how to stop. Knowing that didn't erase what happened, but it let me hold both things at once, the hurt and the understanding, without either one canceling out the other. Here's the part of the story people expect. The part where the villain gets what's coming to them. Where justice arrives with thunder and lightning, where the people who hurt you watch everything they built crumble as karmic punishment for what they did. That's not exactly what happened here. And I think it's important to tell you the truth rather than the satisfying version. My parents' shop closed 6 months later anyway. The debt had grown too large, hidden for too long, quietly poisoning something that used to be steady and proud. I remember the day my father called to tell me, his voice hollow in a way that made my chest ache despite everything. I helped them when they finally told me the full truth, the full extent of it, Numbers I hadn't known about even in that kitchen conversation. Because that's who I am. Not because they deserved it, necessarily. But because I refused to let their failure turn me into someone who abandons people the way I'd been abandoned. I refused to let their broken promise become the thing that broke something essential in me. That, I think, was my revenge, if you want to call it that. Not cruelty. Not silence. Not some carefully orchestrated public reckoning. Just this. I built a life they could not shake the foundation of ever again. I learned to keep my own money separate, my own plans quiet until they were solid, my own trust earned rather than assumed, extended slowly, in proportion to what someone had actually shown me rather than what they'd merely promised. I learned that love, even parental love, is not the same thing as reliability, and that the two can live in the very same people without ever quite touching, without ever quite becoming the same thing. Daniel and I have been married 3 years now. We still tell this story sometimes at dinner, with people who ask how we survived planning a wedding in 8 days, how we ended up in that beautiful little loft instead of the grand barn below it. We leave out the sharpest parts, usually. We keep the ending simple. Her parents backed out, Daniel says, reaching for my hand across the table the way he always does at this part of the story. And she built the whole thing back up herself. In 8 days. That's the truest thing anyone has ever said about me. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I believe there is, because I've turned it over in my hands so many times it's worn smooth. The way river stones get worn smooth from years of water passing over them. It's this. The people who love us are not always the people who can hold us. Sometimes the ones who are supposed to catch us are the very ones who let go. Not out of malice, but out of fear, shame, and the particular kind of cowardice that comes from loving someone so much you can't bear to disappoint them until you have absolutely no other choice. And when that happens, when you're standing in the wreckage of a promise that should have meant something, 8 days or 8 years or 8 minutes before you needed it most, you have 2 choices. You can let it define the rest of your story as the moment you were abandoned, the wound you carry forward, coloring every relationship that comes after with the same fear, the same inability to trust. Or you can let it become the moment you found out exactly how strong you already were, a strength you never would have discovered if everything had simply gone according to plan. I chose the second one. 8 days taught me more about myself than 26 years of careful, honest upbringing ever had. 8 days taught me the difference between people who love you with words and people who love you with actions, the difference between a promise and a foundation, the difference between being rescued and learning to build something sturdy with your own 2 hands. And if you're standing in your own version of that kitchen right now, hearing your own version of figure it out yourself, whatever shape that betrayal has taken in your life, whatever promise was broken when you needed it kept most, I want you to know this. You will figure it out. You always do. And somewhere on the other side of that heartbreak, past the sleepless nights and the frantic phone calls and the grief that reshapes itself into something you learn to carry rather than something that carries you, you'll find a version of yourself that no one, not even the people who were supposed to protect you, can ever shake loose again. That version of you is already inside you, waiting. Betrayal doesn't create her. It only reveals her, the way a fire reveals what a building was really made of, underneath the paint, underneath the polish, down at the structure that was there all along.